Welcome to video 3 in this series on autoimmune disease. This presentation is on genetics and autoimmunity. I'm Robin Puglia. I'm a nutritional therapist and certified functional medicine practitioner. For more information on who I am and what I do, you can see my website, which is www.robinpuglia.com. So, in order to develop autoimmune disease, it is generally considered that you need to have 3 variables in place. You need to have barrier permeability, which leads to immune system dysregulation, and that can be the gut, it can be the skin, it can be the lungs. Barrier permeability essentially creates inflammation in the body and changes the way the immune system works. So that's factor number 1. Factor number 2 is it's considered you need to have the genetic predisposition to develop autoimmunity in the first place. And of course, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And lastly, you need to have some kind of environmental trigger. And usually we're talking about a toxin or a bacteria or a virus. It can be a food, it can be stress in some instances. But today, as I said, we're going to be talking about genetics and the role that genes play. So both genetic and environmental factors play a role in the development of autoimmune disease. But from a scientific perspective, the importance of genes became obvious when it was noticed that the risk of autoimmunity was increased in twins and in siblings of affected individuals. Okay, so it's common sense and simple observation of affected families that allows us to understand that there's a genetic component in autoimmunity. And of course, this was really exciting for the scientific community because if you can find the gene responsible, then you might be able to find a way to switch it off and to cure the disease. Unfortunately, of course, it turns out that it's just not that simple. So let's look at some of the genetic information. And please do bear in mind and give me some grace because I'm trying to keep this really simple. So firstly, I would like to talk about what's called HLA typing. So a lot of the research, if not all of the research, around genetics and autoimmunity, it relates to this, to studies on this HLA variable. Okay, so HLA stands for human leukocyte antigen. And there is a fairly strong connection between the HLA type genes and the development of autoimmune disease. I think it's really important to understand, and for me to say this at this point, that HLA typing doesn't rule out or rule in disease, and it's not diagnostic, but it is used to understand association. So what exactly is HLA? So the HLA system, is the genetic system that codes for major histocompatibility complex proteins in the human immune system. Okay, so MHC proteins in the human immune system are coded for by the HLA system in the genes. And MHC proteins help to regulate the immune system. And in fact, I talked about this a lot. If you're unclear what I'm talking about or it's started to become gobbledygook to you, in my second video, which was on the immune system and how the immune system works and what changes in the immune system in autoimmunity, I talk about the importance of MHC proteins and how they work with antigen presentation in the immune system. So essentially, what I'm saying in this instance is, so a gene is a recipe for a protein. So the HLA system is the system of genes that tells the body how to make these MHC proteins. And the MHC proteins are really, really important because they help us to regulate the way that our immune system works in response to environmental stimuli. They help us to understand when we need to be responding to something, an external variable. So the HLA genes then have got a lot of variance because this allows them to fine-tune the adaptive immune system responses. So HLA, the HLAs A, B, and C correspond to MHC class 1 antigen presentation, and they present proteins from inside the cell to killer T cells. So, for example, if the cell is infected by a virus, the way that our immune system is capable of responding to that is that the MHC protein samples the viral protein inside the cell, and it creates a kind of a billboard to show it on the outside of the cell so that your immune system recognizes there's a problem in that cell. I need to respond, and will likely destroy the infected cell in that instance. So very, very important for viral infection, for example. And then HLA-D corresponds to MHC class 2, and they present antigens from outside the cell to the T helper cells. And T helper cells stimulate antibody-producing B cells, which then make antibodies. And of course, antibodies are a kind of a cornerstone part of autoimmune function and the immune function in autoimmunity. It's how we flag a protein as being problematic so that we can have the appropriate immune response. So what does that all mean exactly? So it means that you don't really have a gene that gives you autoimmune disease. I think that this is a really important thing to understand, that the genes that predispose you to autoimmunity or that increase your risk of developing autoimmunity are not for an autoimmune disease, okay? But they're the genes that affect the way that your immune system responds to environmental stimuli such as infection. And I think that that is a really critical thing for you to understand. It's not a gene for autoimmunity. It's a gene that tells your body that changes the way that your body responds and how your immune system responds if you have a virus or if you are exposed to a bacteria. So the association of the HLA class 1 region, independent of known HLA class 2 effects, has been really well understood in regards to some autoimmune diseases. Okay, so we start to have a look at this HLA DQ2 and DQ8, for example, with the classic form of celiac disease. Okay, so HLA DQ2 and DQ8 are the genes that they test for if they're testing you to see if you are at risk of developing celiac disease. So this is pretty well understood. And remember that it's this D, this is the D form of the HLA that tells us that this is associated with that MHC class 2, which determines the T cell B cell interaction that is involved in the production of antibodies. So you'll see in this entire list of genes that the first three, they're all these D classes. And so HLA-DR3 is associated with type 1 diabetes, autoimmune hepatitis, lupus, and Sjogren's. HLA-DR4 is associated with rheumatoid arthritis and type 1 diabetes. And then, though, we start to have, we start to have now some new information that shows us that it's not just the HLA-D family that's involved with autoimmune disease. We're starting now to see that there are some B and C associations which have to do with that MHC1 complex, which is about viral antigen presentation, or that's the mechanism. So we see HLA-B27 associated with ankylosing spondylitis, and in fact there is a fairly also well understood infectious association with ankylosing spondylitis that involves the gut. And we're now starting to see some of the HLA-B and C types associated also with type 1 diabetes, with multiple sclerosis, with Graves' disease. And I think that this suggests a very strong role for infection, specifically for viral involvement in the initiation of those diseases. And of course, that is something that naturopathic medicine, alternative medicine, nutritional therapy, has been saying for a really long time. So this is not actually such a big surprise. It's known to a lot of people already, especially if they're in clinical practice, but it's being proven and it's being explained a lot more recently about the susceptibility and why certain people are more susceptible. So, for example, everybody has Epstein-Barr virus. Why are some people more susceptible to developing autoimmune disease when they have Epstein-Barr virus on board? Partially that's to do with the genes that they have that tell their body how to respond to a virus, if that makes sense. Okay, so it's more complicated than just do you have the gene, because 35% of the population have the gene for celiac disease, for example, and only 1 to 2% have actual celiac disease. And then around 2% of those who have been diagnosed with celiac disease don't actually necessarily have the gene for it. So it's not quite as simple as single gene. There are genes that predispose you to hyper-response of the immune system, to generally being pro-inflammatory in the presence of certain environmental factors. There are genes that make you more susceptible to infection. There are genes that make you more susceptible to toxic exposures. You might have very poor glutathione levels and therefore more oxidative stress. And we know that oxidative stress is a variable that's associated with increased prevalence of autoimmune disease such as lupus. You might have a combination of more than one of those genes. And of course, that then makes you very susceptible to developing problems in the Western world, where we have so many environmental triggers that are just part of our everyday life. We have stress, we have oxidative stress, we've got chemicals in the home, we've got processed foods. So when you have a combination of the genes and a combination of environmental factors, you might just be at higher risk. And on top of all of that now, we have, when we're talking about genes, there is something called a single nucleotide polymorphism, which is also known as a SNP, or also known as a gene variant. And this is where there are lots of shades of grey that start to become involved. So, we start with, do you have this gene or do you have that gene? And in some cases, we can also ask, and which version of this gene do you have? And as I said, a gene is a recipe for a protein in the body. And a protein is basically a string of amino acids. So it's like a word that is spelled with up to several hundred letters. So you can see here in the slide that here is a piece of a protein and it's a string of letters. That's how it's coded. And so the gene is telling your body how to spell that word. And with that information, that's how your body assembles the protein. So with a SNP, with a single nucleotide polymorphism, you are replacing one letter with another letter. So in this example, in this little cartoon here, we're replacing the G with the C, or vice versa. They're interchangeable. And this might have no effect. There are lots of SNPs that we can have in the body, so this might have no effect, but it might also change the way that the protein functions at the end of that process. And some of this information is known to us. Okay, so sometimes we understand that if you have a SNP in this area, that the end result of that will be a change in the way that your body works. So this is definitely going to have a role in understanding any given individual's autoimmunity. But unfortunately, this is a new area. So we've got it's actually a huge amount of information at the moment, and it's increasing, but there is still a lack of strong conclusive evidence. So we can't say with any surety what the definite associations are at this point in time. We're still really early on in our understanding of the role of SNPs in general, and also, of course, in autoimmune diseases. So a lot more information is needed in this area. And if you don't happen to have a full genetic screen to hand, in the intake paperwork in any functional medicine practitioner, we're going to be asking about your family history, because this is going to tell us something regarding your genetic susceptibility for increased risk of developing autoimmune diseases. And this is really important, I personally think, when we're dealing with children, or when you have children, if you have an autoimmune disease, because we need to understand the risk of developing an autoimmune disease in a child. If we can identify the risk early, and we can identify a child that has the lifestyle variables involved, so there's a strong genetic role, and also the child is exhibiting immune dysregulation and inflammatory symptoms early on, then we have the opportunity to intervene before the autoimmune disease really develops, and we have the potential then to change the trajectory of that process. And I think, of course, prevention is what is it they say, that an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, which is definitely true when it comes to autoimmunity. So family history is the first place, if you don't have genetic screening, family history is the first place that we start to really understand whether or not autoimmune disease is relevant to you. And what we see is that autoimmunity tends to cluster in families with lots of different autoimmune diseases sprinkled across the wider family net. Okay, so grandma might have rheumatoid arthritis, and Uncle Sam has psoriasis, and Auntie Emma has Hashimoto's, and her sister has celiac disease. And, because they all have a different label, they all have a different diagnosis, perhaps nobody in the family has realized that each of these things are actually connected to each other, and therefore that your child is at a higher risk of developing autoimmune disease as a result of that. So this clustering in families is very, very interesting, of course, because this is where the genetic component comes into play. So there is this genetic susceptibility to autoimmune disease, but it's not necessarily determining which disease develops in an individual. It can be one of a few. This is called clustering, autoimmune clustering. So we know that there is a really high risk for first-degree relatives of almost all of the autoimmune diseases. So Crohn's in a first-degree relative is up to 20%. The first-degree relatives for multiple sclerosis is 5%, and this increases up to about 40% for identical twins, and so on. And again, we do see this pattern, except that sometimes the autoimmune diseases are related and sometimes they're not. So, for example, multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis don't tend to appear in the same family. That's not never true, but it's much less frequently true than, for example, rheumatoid arthritis and Hashimoto's or celiac disease. So autoimmunity is complex. It's multifactorial. It's thought to present in those who have a certain susceptibility in their genetic chain. So we call that the weak link in the chain. But you must also have the environmental triggers in place. So I no longer really think about it, to be honest with you, as the weak link in the chain, because the reason that we have developed those attributes in our genes in the first place, your genes don't ever make any changes unless they're of an advantage of some kind, right? So the chance of you, there must be a benefit to you having that gene, but the environment now has changed. Our modern environment no longer suits our genes. So perhaps if you had genes that allowed you to have a massive response to an infection, you would be less likely to die of an acute infection, right? That's of benefit in the olden days before antibiotics, when acute infection was of significant risk. But in this day and age, where acute infection is not such a big problem, but chronic infection is much more prevalent, now we see a change in the environment that those genes are in, and we're seeing this rise in autoimmune disease, which is potentially as a result. So one way that people say that is that your genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And another way of describing it is that, except in the rare instance of single gene diseases, that your genes never tell you who you are. only what is possible, and the rest is up to you. And I think that that is extremely important to understand with autoimmune disease, because if you think about it just as this is my genes and it's fate, I just have these bad genes and there's nothing that I can do about that, then you're missing the point that there are so many variables in your environment that you have the ability to change. And when you understand that you can change a lot about your environment and the environment that your genes are in, and that has the potential to help you massively improve your quality of life, especially when you have already been diagnosed and you're suffering with symptoms, but also we can change the environment that your children are in and that your children's genes are in as a way of potentially preventing the development of autoimmune disease in the next generation. Then this interplay between genes and environment become possibly even more critical. So that's the end of genetics and autoimmunity. It's a complex topic and I have tried to keep it simple and short. My next video will be on the gut and autoimmune disease, which of course is super important information. And I've got some really, really mind-blowing new information to share in that one, so stay tuned. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do leave me a comment if you found it useful, and thank you very much for watching.